She showed up to a blind date with $5 in her purse, her mother's old dress on her back, and just enough hope left to make one terrible mistake. Then the text came. He was never coming. He was laughing at her from somewhere else while she sat alone under candlelight in a room full of people pretending love was easy. And what happened next was the part nobody saw coming. Because at the next table sat a man powerful enough to ruin lives with a phone call, and for some reason he could not look away from hers. This isn't just a romance. It's a story about humiliation, hunger, power, and the one moment a broken woman is finally seen. Stay with me until the end and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The truth was, Claire Bennett had almost not gone to the restaurant at all. An hour earlier, she had been standing barefoot on the cracked tile floor of her apartment in Pilsen, facing a mirror so old the silver had started to fade around the edges. The bathroom light buzzed above her head in a tired yellow hum. On the sink sat a curling iron that only worked if she held the cord at a certain angle, a tube of mascara she was trying to stretch another week, and a lipstick stub she had melted once with a lighter just to use every last bit of it. Her dress was hanging from the shower rod. Cream silk, or what had once been silk with a pearl collar and tiny covered buttons down the front. The fabric had gone soft with age. One cuff had been stitched by hand where the seam had torn years ago. It had belonged to her mother. Claire touched the sleeve before she put it on the way some people touch a cross without thinking. Not out of superstition, out of memory. Her mother had worn it to Easter service when Claire was little. Claire remembered sitting beside her in a wooden pew, tracing the pearl buttons with 2 small fingers while her mother sang off key and did not care who heard. Then, years later, after the cancer, after the bills, after the apartment had gone from full to quiet, Claire had worn the same dress on the day she got accepted into nursing school. Her mother had cried when she saw her in it, not big movie tears, just a shine in her eyes and one trembling smile. Tonight, Claire wore it because she needed to feel like something about her still came from love. She had met the man online 2 weeks earlier. Nothing dramatic, no soulmate language. Just a few kind messages, a few jokes that landed a sense that maybe he was ordinary in the best possible way. Someone who worked in insurance. Someone who liked old movies and hated cilantro. Someone who asked what she was studying and actually waited for the answer. That was all it took these days. Not because Claire was foolish, because she was tired. Tired in the deep way that had nothing to do with sleep. Tired of rent notices on the counter. Tired of balancing classes and clinicals and waitressing shifts until the days blurred together into fluorescent hallways and sore feet. Tired of men who flirted with her like they were trying on a jacket they never planned to buy. Tired of pretending she did not want what everybody said was basic. A meal with someone who showed up. A conversation that did not ask her to be less than she was. A little kindness without a hidden price. She was 23 years old, halfway through nursing school, smart enough to know hope could humiliate you, and young enough to keep trying anyway. That was the part people never understood. Hope was not soft. Hope was expensive. She had stood in front of the mirror and fixed the collar with both hands, curled the front pieces of her hair, dabbed perfume behind her ears from the tiny sample bottle she had been saving for no reason she could explain. Then she checked her purse, phone, keys, lip gloss, a folded $5 bill. That was it. She laughed once under her breath when she saw it, though there was nothing funny about it. $5 was bus fare. $5 was 2 apples and a generic granola bar from the campus vending machine. $5 was not a dinner in River North where the menus did not list prices unless they had to. But she had told herself she was not going there to be rescued. She was going there to be seen. By the time she locked her apartment and headed for the train, dusk had already started settling over the city. Chicago, in early fall, had a way of making even ordinary evenings look cinematic. Streetlights flickered awake one by one. Wind pressed cold fingers through the gaps between buildings. Somewhere nearby, a siren wailed and disappeared into traffic. On the train downtown, Claire watched her reflection in the window float over darkening neighborhoods and tried not to feel ridiculous. It was just dinner. It was just one man. It was just one night that might be bad or awkward or forgettable. She could survive any of those things. What she had not prepared for was cruelty that casual. So, when Vincent DeLuca looked at her from across that candlelit room and said, "You deserve to eat, even when the world tries to teach you." Otherwise, the sentence did something dangerous. It did not save her. It stayed with her. For the next 3 days, Claire tried to go back to the life she understood. She had clinical rounds at St. Joseph Hospital on Thursday morning. She wore scrubs with a coffee stain she had not been able to wash out completely and tied her hair back so tightly her temples hurt by noon. She spent 4 hours on her feet checking charts, practicing vital signs, and pretending she did not notice how the residents talked over the older nurses until they needed something from them. An elderly woman in room 614 squeezed Claire's hand after a blood pressure check and called her sweetheart. A mother in pediatrics thanked her for finding the right blanket for her feverish son. Those tiny moments held her together more than sleep ever did. After clinicals, she took the bus across town to a diner near campus where she worked 3 evening shifts a week. She carried plates of eggs and burgers to men in work boots, smiled through bad tips, refilled coffee. She could not afford to order for herself and stood in the kitchen freezer for 30 seconds during break just to be alone in the cold. At home, she studied from color-coded flashcards at a card table that wobbled every time she leaned on it. The radiator hissed like it was angry to be alive. Her upstairs neighbor practiced trumpet badly after midnight. She ate ramen with frozen peas and told herself she was too busy to think about the man in the restaurant. The lie held until Saturday morning. There was a small coffee place on a side street near campus that Claire only visited when she needed the wireless connection and a booth that did not smell like fryer oil. It had mismatched chairs, old brick walls, and a chalkboard menu full of drinks she never ordered because adding oat milk should not cost what it did. She went there with her laptop, 2 textbooks, and $7 in quarters and singles she had scraped together from a jar above the fridge. The line moved slowly. A couple argued softly over almond versus whole milk. A student in a Northwestern hoodie typed with both thumbs while pretending not to block the pickup counter. Claire counted the money in her palm twice before she reached the register. 1 small coffee. Plain, no flavor, no pastry. The barista took the bills, turned to make the drink, then came back with 2 cups instead of 1. Claire frowned. "I only ordered 1. The girl smiled in the distracted way baristas do when they have already moved on to the next thing. "The second one's been covered." Claire's stomach dropped. For a stupid instant she thought of the restaurant, and humiliation rushed back hot under her skin. She turned too quickly, half expecting a table full of frat boys or some man with a grin he had not earned. Instead, she saw Vincent DeLuca sitting alone near the back window. No suit this time. No charcoal wool, no cufflinks, no expensive silence shaped like armor. He wore a dark button-down with the sleeves rolled to his forearms. The first button at his throat was open. A laptop sat on the table beside an untouched espresso. He looked like he belonged there and nowhere at all. His eyes met hers over the rim of his cup. Not smug, not performative, calm, as if he had known she would turn and had been willing to wait for it. Claire stood there longer than she meant to. Then she picked up both cups and walked toward him. "You do realize this is becoming a pattern," she said. One side of his mouth lifted. "I was hoping it was." She set 1 cup down in front of him, then slid into the chair across from him before she could second-guess herself. Up close in daylight, he looked even harder to place. Older than the boys who hovered around campus pretending they had everything figured out. Younger than the men who mistook weariness for wisdom. Maybe late 30s. Dark hair touched with the first hint of gray at the temples. Strong hands. A scar near his wrist that vanished beneath his sleeve when he moved. "You just happen to spend your mornings buying coffee for women you barely know?" Claire asked. "Only the women who glare at me while holding exact change." That almost made her smile. Were you watching me at the register? I noticed you were ready to argue with the barista over $1.20. I would have won. I don't doubt it. She wrapped both hands around the paper cup more for something to do than for warmth. Outside wind sent leaves skittering along the sidewalk. Inside the espresso machine hissed and the room smelled like cinnamon and ground beans and wet coats drying. He watched her for a second, not invasive, just attentive in a way that made most people uncomfortable. With him, it made her feel oddly visible. So he said, Claire Bennett. Her brows lifted. You remembered my full name. I remember things. That sounds more ominous than charming. Most truths do. The answer should have bothered her. Instead, it made her curious. She took a sip of coffee and discovered with immediate annoyance that he had somehow guessed exactly how she took it. Just enough cream to cut the bitterness. No sugar. That's unsettling, she said. What is this? She lifted the cup a little. Should I be offended that you know how I take my coffee after meeting me once? He leaned back slightly, studying her with that same unreadable stillness. At the restaurant, you added cream stirred twice, then tasted it before deciding against sugar. You also pushed the glass of water to the left because you're right-handed, and you were making space for a plate you were trying to pretend you didn't want. Claire stared at him. That she said slowly is either impressive or deeply concerning. A small laugh slipped out of him before he could stop it. It changed his face in a way she had not expected. Not softer exactly, more human. There it is, he said. What? The expression you make right before you decide whether to trust somebody. Claire leaned her elbows on the table. And what's the verdict? I'm waiting on yours. That disarmed her more than charm would have. Around them, the coffee shop moved on without permission. A stroller rattled past the front window. Somebody dropped a spoon. A college kid at the next table mouthed along to music in his headphones, eyes on his screen. The city kept happening, and inside it Claire sat across from a man who did not fit anywhere in the frame. What do you do? She asked. He did not answer right away. He closed his laptop with one hand and looked at her as if weighing how much truth could pass between strangers before the floor gave way. Distribution, he said at last. She blinked. That is not a real answer. It is a real answer. It's just not a detailed one. What kind of distribution? Food, shipping, logistics, whatever needs moving. That sounds vague on purpose. Maybe it is. Claire narrowed her eyes. You always talk like that. Only when I'm being polite. This time she did laugh. He asked about school. And unlike most people, he did not ask in the bright, empty way that meant he wanted a title and nothing else. He asked what kind of nursing she wanted to go into. He asked if she liked clinicals. He asked what scared her most about the work. She answered more honestly than she meant to. I'm good when somebody needs something, she said. I know what to do when there's a checklist, a chart, a pulse, a problem in front of me. I'm not scared of blood. I'm not scared of hard work. I'm scared of missing something that matters because I'm tired. Vincent listened with the kind of quiet that made more room, not less. And what doesn't scare you? He asked. Claire looked down at the lid of her cup. Being tired. Something in his face shifted. Not pity, recognition. Before she could ask him what he had heard in that, a text buzzed on his phone. He glanced at the screen and the temperature around him seemed to drop a degree. It lasted only a second. Then the phone was face down on the table and his attention was back on her. You should eat more than coffee before noon, he said. There it is. He tilted his head. What? The part where men hear I'm busy and decide to become nutritional authorities. I'm not an authority on anything before coffee. Liar. He smiled again, smaller this time. When she left an hour later, he did not ask for her number. He did not push. He did not turn the conversation into a transaction. He just stood when she stood, nodded once, and said, Good luck with your shift tonight, Claire. She stopped with one hand on the strap of her bag. I didn't tell you I had a shift tonight. No, he said. You didn't. Then he walked out into the cold as if the conversation had not just tilted her whole morning off its axis. For the rest of the day she tried to make sense of him and failed. By Monday she had almost convinced herself to let it go. Then an unknown number sent her a message just before lunch. There's a community seminar tomorrow at 11 on childhood nutrition and labeling standards. You might like it. No signature, no explanation, just an address in West Loop and a link to a registration page already filled in under her name. Claire stared at the screen for a full minute before typing back. "How did you get this number?" The reply took longer this time. "You listed it on a volunteer form for the student health drive last month." She frowned. That was true. Still strange, still too much. Another message appeared. "You can ignore this if you want." She should have. Probably any sane woman would have. But the seminar topic tugged at her. Pediatrics had always gotten under her skin more than she admitted out loud. Tiny bodies, fragile systems, mistakes that mattered fast. And there had been something in the coffee shop when Vincent listened to her, something that made her feel less like a tired student and more like a person with a mind worth noticing. So the next day after class, she found herself standing in the lobby of a community center tucked between two office buildings, holding a paper cup of bad coffee and wondering if she had made a mistake. The event room was bright in the unforgiving way all community spaces were bright. Fluorescent lights, folding chairs in neat rows, a projector humming against a white screen. On the front table sat bowls of Clementine's granola bars and brochures printed with smiling cartoon vegetables. Around Claire, the seats filled with young mothers, public health students, a few pediatric nurses, and two polished-looking interns who seemed to think carrying clipboards made them taller. Claire slipped into a chair in the third row and opened a notebook she had grabbed out of habit. She told herself she was here for the material, not the man who might or might not have arranged it. The presenter was a pediatric dietitian from Northwestern, with perfect posture and a polished voice. She moved through slides about preservative sodium levels, misleading labels, and allergen statements on snack products marketed to toddlers. Most of the room listened politely. Some took photos of the screen. A baby cried once and was rocked back to quiet. Claire listened harder. When the speaker breezed past a section on cross-contamination warnings without addressing inconsistent labeling in off-brand products, Claire raised her hand before she could stop herself. "Yes?" the woman asked. Claire swallowed. How often are parents actually taught the difference between a manufacturing trace warning and a direct ingredient disclosure? Because if the packaging is inconsistent, especially across lower-cost brands, then a lot of families are going to assume the same language means the same level of risk, and it doesn't. The room turned. The speaker paused. "That's a very good point." Claire felt heat climb her neck, but once she started, the questions kept coming naturally. About access, about literacy on labels, about preservatives common in low-cost food sold in neighborhoods where parents had fewer alternatives, about what pediatric clinics could do to communicate risk in plain language instead of handing out brochures written for people with time and resources to spare. She was not trying to impress anyone. That was why she did. Near the back of the room, leaning against the wall with his hands in his pockets, Vincent watched her. He had arrived quietly enough that Claire had not noticed him until the seminar broke for questions, and someone shifted in front of the doorway. There he was, half in shadow eyes fixed on her as if the rest of the room had dissolved. She looked away first. Afterward, while people gathered handouts and exchanged thin networking smiles, Claire made for the exit, before anyone could trap her in small talk. She had almost reached the hallway when Vincent stepped aside from the wall and let her pass into the quieter corridor outside. "You came," he said. Claire let out a breath that sounded steadier than she felt. "You sound surprised." "Hopeful, not surprised. You paid for the registration." He did not deny it. "That was unnecessary. You showed up anyway." She looked at him, really looked. He was dressed simply again. Dark coat, dark shirt. No tie, the kind of clothes that still somehow looked expensive because they fit too well. But there was nothing flashy about him. No gold chain, no easy arrogance, just control. And a fatigue behind it he kept tucked away like contraband. "Why do you keep doing that?" she asked softly. "Doing what?" "Showing up where I am. Knowing things. paying for things I didn't ask for. The question did not offend him. It did something worse. It made him careful. For a moment, he glanced down the hall toward the room they had just left, then back at her. "Because you ask good questions," he said. Claire almost laughed. "That's not an answer. It's the one I'm giving." She folded her arms. "That kind of line probably works better on women who are less tired than I am." A flicker of warmth touched his mouth. "I don't think tired has much to do with it." "Then what does?" He stepped a little closer, not enough to crowd her, just enough to lower his voice without forcing it. "Most people spend all day trying to sound clever. You walked into a room full of strangers and cared more about whether children could get hurt than whether anyone thought you were impressive." The hallway felt suddenly smaller. Claire looked down at her notebook, then back up at him. "That still doesn't explain how you got my number." This time he did laugh. Soft, brief, gone almost before it arrived. "I already did explain it. You explained it in a way that made me want to check all my accounts for fraud." Fair. She should have left then. She knew that. There was a boundary somewhere in all this, and he kept approaching it with the patience of someone who did not break rules so much as wait for them to become irrelevant. Instead, she asked, "And what if I didn't come today?" He considered the question with more seriousness than it deserved. "Then I would have been wrong about you." "About what?" His gaze held hers steady and unreadable. "That you care enough to show up even when nobody's watching." Her breath caught on something she could not name. Neither of them spoke for a few seconds. In the room behind them, chairs scraped the floor. Someone laughed too loudly. A baby fussed and was comforted. Ordinary life pressed on around them, but the air between them had sharpened into something neither casual nor safe. Claire broke it first. "I have class," she said. "Then you should go." She blinked, almost annoyed by the simplicity of it. "That's it." "What did you expect?" "I'm still deciding." His eyes moved briefly to the doorway, then back to her face. There was a kind of discipline in him that felt almost old-fashioned. Not restraint for show. Restraint because if he let go of it, something else might take its place. "Go to class, Claire," he said. "You'll be late." She hated that she smiled. When she turned away, she felt his attention on her all the way down the hall. That night, the city was rinsed in the kind of cold rain that turned sidewalks into mirrors. Claire stayed at the library later than she meant to, buried under case studies and caffeine, and the false confidence that comes with telling yourself, "One more hour will somehow save the week." By the time she packed up, the building had thinned to graduate students, janitors, and 2 undergrads asleep over open laptops. Outside, the street was nearly empty. She adjusted the strap of her backpack and stepped under the awning. Water dripped from the edge in a silver line. Across the road, neon from a liquor store bled red and blue across the wet pavement. A bus roared past without slowing. The wind cut through her coat at the seams. Claire started walking toward the train. Her shoes clicked against the slick sidewalk. Half a block down, she became aware of how quiet everything felt. Not peaceful, hollow. The kind of city quiet that makes you notice every set of footsteps that is not yours. She glanced back once. No one. At the next corner, a black sedan eased up beside the curb. Not fast, not reckless, deliberate. The rear window lowered. Vincent sat inside, one hand resting lightly on the door face, lit in fragments by passing headlights. "You shouldn't be walking alone this late," he said. Claire stopped under a street lamp, rain speckling her hair. "You always appear exactly when I'm starting to think this is all in my head. Get in." That wasn't an answer. "No," he said. It was an invitation. She looked up and down the street. The train station was still 3 blocks away. The rain had thickened. Somewhere behind her, a gate clanged shut in an alley. "You are aware," she said, "that under normal circumstances this is how women end up in documentaries." One corner of his mouth lifted. "Under normal circumstances, I'd agree with you." She stared at him another beat, then opened the door and slid inside. The car was warm, quiet, and smelled faintly of leather and cedar. Not a rideshare, not hired for the evening. This was his car or one of them. The driver up front kept his eyes on the road and said nothing. Claire noticed the earpiece first, then the way his shoulders stayed perfectly squared even while turning. She set her bag on her lap. "You need less mysterious hobbies," she said. Vincent looked out at the rain streaking the window. "I'll add it to the list." The city moved around them in reflections and shadow. Headlights washed over his face, revealing hard lines at the mouth, a tiredness near the eyes he wore like another layer of clothing. In the soft dark of the back seat, Claire noticed things she had missed before. The faint scar near his jaw, the way his left hand flexed once subtle and unconscious when a motorcycle cut too close in traffic. "Do you do this a lot?" she asked. "What?" "Watch people." He glanced at her. "Only the interesting ones." That answer was worse. It was honest. They turned down her street. Two men were standing near the mouth of the alley beside her building. Hoodies, up hands in pockets, too still for the weather. Claire might have thought nothing of them if she had been walking alone. But she was not alone, and Vincent saw them at the same instant she did. Something in him hardened so fast it was almost visible. He tapped once on the divider between the seats. The sedan slowed, then stopped half a car length short of the curb. The two men looked up. One of them met Vincent's eyes through the glass, and went pale enough that even from the back seat, Claire could see it. The change was immediate. No swagger, no stare down, just recognition followed by retreat. One grabbed the other by the sleeve and they vanished into the alley as if the darkness had opened and swallowed them whole. The driver pulled to the curb. Claire turned slowly toward Vincent. "Who are you?" For a moment, all she could hear was rain ticking against the roof. He did not reach for her, did not charm his way around the question. He looked at the apartment building ahead, then back at her, and when he spoke, his voice had gone very quiet. "Someone you should keep your distance from." Claire held his gaze a second longer, then opened the door and stepped into the rain. By the time she reached the front steps and turned back, the black sedan was already pulling away its taillights, burning red against the wet street until they disappeared around the corner. By the time Claire reached her apartment, the rain had worked its way through the shoulders of her coat and into the cuffs of her sleeves. The hallway smelled like wet, concrete old paint, and somebody's burnt garlic dinner from 2 floors down. She climbed the stairs with the ache of a long day, settling into her knees, one hand sliding along the banister polished smooth by years of other tired people going home. Inside, her apartment met her with its usual smallness. The radiator hissed in the corner. The kitchen light flickered once before deciding to stay on. Her textbooks were still spread across the card table where she had left them that morning, notes tucked into chapters on pediatric assessment and emergency response. A mug with dried coffee at the bottom sat by the sink. On the narrow windowsill above it, a basil plant she had tried and failed to keep alive leaned brown and defeated toward the glass. Claire locked the door, dropped her keys into the ceramic bowl by the entry, and stood still for a moment. Her pulse had not fully settled. It was not just the car. It was not just the two men by the alley. It was the way Vincent had changed in a single breath. 1 second, composed, almost amused. The next, sharp and cold enough to make strangers disappear without a word. Someone you should keep your distance from. She took off her coat and hung it over the back of a chair to dry. Then she filled a glass at the sink and drank it too fast. The water tasted faintly metallic. Outside, the rain kept tapping the window as if the night were trying to get back in. Claire reached for her phone, stared at the blank screen, then set it back down. What exactly was she supposed to do with him? Normal men made themselves easy to understand. They lied in familiar ways. They bragged too much, asked too little, wanted quick things and cheap endings. You knew the shape of them even when you were disappointed. Vincent was different in a way that irritated her because it got under her skin. He did not crowd. He did not flatter. He did not chase her with obvious hunger. He simply kept appearing at the edges of her life, as if he had the patience of someone used to waiting for the right door to open. That should have felt invasive. Instead, it felt dangerous for another reason, because some part of her was already listening for him. She changed into old sweatpants and one of her nursing school t-shirts, tied her damp hair up, and sat at the card table with her notes. She tried to study dosage calculations, tried to concentrate on body weight ratios and medication charts and the clean logic of numbers. But the page kept blurring into the memory of his voice in the car low and even telling her to keep her distance as if the warning cost him something. At 11:30 she gave up, brushed her teeth, and turned off the lights. Her bedroom was barely a bedroom. Just enough space for a narrow bed, a second-hand dresser, and the standing lamp she had rescued from the curb 2 summers ago and taught herself to rewire. The curtains were thin enough that the city never fully disappeared. Light from the street below painted slow-moving bars across the ceiling whenever cars passed. She lay awake longer than she meant to. Thought of her mother. Thought of how quickly life could shift, not with great tragedies at first, but with small tilts. One conversation. One choice. One person looking at you a little too closely. Then sometime after midnight, sleep finally came. It did not last. The pounding at the door tore her awake so fast, her heart slammed against her ribs before her eyes were even open. For one confused second, she thought it was part of a dream. Then it came again. Harder this time. A heavy, urgent blow that rattled the lock and sent a picture frame on the wall trembling. Claire sat up, breath caught high in her throat. The room was dark except for the weak spill of streetlight through the curtains. Her phone glowed on the nightstand, 12:17 a.m. The pounding came a third time. Not the unsteady knock of a drunk neighbor. Not police. Not the landlord who would sooner die than climb 3 flights after dark. This was someone who needed the door open now. Claire swung her legs out of bed and crossed the apartment barefoot, every floorboard sounding too loud. She did not turn on the overhead light. She moved by memory, by shadows, by the pale line of the kitchen tile. At the door, she kept the chain on and leaned toward the peephole. Her breath stopped. Vincent stood on the other side. His dark shirt was torn at the shoulder and slick with rain. One side of his face was shadowed with bruising already coming up beneath the skin. Blood ran down his forearm and dripped from his fingers to the hallway floor. He looked less like a man arriving somewhere than like a man who had held himself together through sheer force and was almost out of time. Claire opened the door before fear could catch up, only as far as the chain allowed. Vincent. His eyes lifted to hers. They were clear alert, too alert for the amount of blood on him. "I need 5 minutes," he said. No apology, no explanation, just that. And that more than the blood told her how bad it was. Men like him did not come asking unless every other option had already failed. She slid the chain free and pulled the door open wide enough for him to step inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the apartment seemed to shrink around him. Not because he was large, because he carried a kind of pressure with him. Rain, cold, violence held on a tight leash. Claire shut the door fast and locked it. "Sit down." He looked as if he might argue, then thought better of it. He crossed to the kitchen table with the precise control of someone refusing to let pain show before it had permission. His hand braced once against the chair back. That was the only sign. Claire snapped on the light over the sink and the full mess of him came into view. Blood along the right sleeve. A deep cut high on his arm. Bruising at the ribs where the shirt clung dark and damp. Split skin over 2 knuckles. Rainwater beading along the line of his jaw. "Jesus," she whispered. "I've had worse." That was not a question. He sat. She was already moving. The drawer under the sink held what passed for a medical supply kit in the apartment of a nursing student who knew hospitals did not follow you home. Gauze, alcohol pads, tape, gloves, a half-full bottle of saline, suture thread she had no business owning outside lab practice, but had taken anyway because life was expensive and preparedness felt like power. She yanked a clean dish towel from the oven handle, wet it, wrung it out, came back to the table. "Take off the shirt." His eyes lifted. "Claire, I'm not asking for fun." For the first time that night, the corner of his mouth almost moved. Not quite a smile. More a recognition that she was still herself. He peeled the shirt off one shoulder with care. The movement exposed more damage. A long cut along the upper arm, shallow but bleeding enough to soak fabric. a bloom of dark purple beneath his ribs. Another mark near his side that looked like someone had tried to hold a blade there and missed something vital by inches. Claire sucked in a breath. "Hospital," she said immediately. "No." She met his eyes. "That is not how this works. Tonight it is. Tonight you are bleeding onto my kitchen floor, and I'm asking you not to take me to a hospital. You do not get to make that sound reasonable just because you say it quietly." He leaned back in the chair, one hand gripping the edge hard enough for the knuckles to whiten. "Please." It was not the word she expected from him. It changed the room. Claire set the towel against the cut and applied pressure. He inhaled sharply through his nose but did not move away. "Start talking." "Not yet." Then bleed in silence. She cleaned the wound with saline hands steady even while her thoughts raced. Training took over where emotions stumbled. Check depth. Watch for arterial spray. Assess breathing, skin color, pupils, response. He tracked her movements closely but not like a suspicious patient. Like a man cataloging exits while someone stitched him back into one piece. When she reached for scissors and carefully cut the sleeve back farther, metal flashed at his ankle. Claire stilled. A knife. Narrow, sheathed, hidden beneath his pant leg. Her gaze lifted to his face. He did not explain it. Of course he did not. She cleaned in silence for another minute. The apartment had grown so quiet she could hear the refrigerator cycling on the hiss of the radiator, the rain easing outside into a thin, steady patter. Vincent watched the curtained window over her shoulder more than he watched her hands. "Who did this?" she asked. He looked at the wall, not her. A disagreement. That is not a real answer. It will have to do. Claire pressed harder than necessary with the gauze. He winced. "That one was on purpose," he said. "Good." She worked with the concentration that had gotten her through exams, clinicals, grief rent, and every other thing that had tried to knock her off her feet. Thread, needle, shallow breaths. The cut would need stitches, not many, if his body cooperated, and he held still. "3, she said. "What? 3 stitches? Maybe 4 if you keep talking. You think threats are charming. I think they're efficient." He looked at her then. Really looked. There was tiredness in his face now deeper than before. Not only from pain, from carrying too much too long. Claire tied the final stitch and trimmed the thread. "You need antibiotics." "I'll manage." "You need a doctor." "No." Her temper flared. "Do you have any idea how arrogant that sounds?" "Yes." "And that doesn't bother you?" He was quiet a moment. Then lower. "A lot of things bother me, Claire." The way he said her name pulled at something in her chest she had no interest in examining. She taped fresh gauze over the wound and stepped back to study the rest of him. "Show me your ribs." "That sounds intimate." She stared until he exhaled and lifted the edge of his undershirt enough for her to see the bruise spreading across his side. Not broken, she thought. Probably not. Tender, ugly. The kind that made breathing expensive by morning. She reached out before she could think better of it, fingertips light against the edge of the bruise as she checked for instability. His muscles tightened instantly beneath her hand. Not rejection, reaction. Her pulse kicked. "Does this hurt?" "Yes." "That means you're alive." "So I've heard." She stepped back and moved to the sink to rinse the blood from her fingers. Pink water circled the drain. Her own reflection in the dark glass above the sink looked pale and startled. Behind her, Vincent remained at the table, silent, one hand resting near the knife at his ankle, without seeming to. Finally, she turned. "No doctors. Fine. Then tell me why." He did not answer immediately. His gaze had gone past her again toward the living room, toward the door, toward everything a man like him might count without meaning to. "Because hospitals ask questions," he said at last. So, some answers get people killed." Claire felt the cold spread through her slowly this time, not with shock, but with shape. There it was. Not mystery, not intrigue, something darker and more solid. What happened tonight? His jaw tightened. Business. No one gets carved open over business, unless the business is illegal. His eyes met hers. Neither of them looked away. Then a sound came from outside. Footsteps in the hallway. More than one set. Vincent was on his feet so fast the chair scraped hard against the floor. Everything in him changed. The fatigue vanished first, then the pain. In its place came something colder than fear and sharper than anger. He stepped between Claire and the front door without seeming to think about it. "Bedroom," he said. Her own pulse leaped. What now? The footsteps stopped outside. Silence. Then the doorknob moved once slowly. Claire stared. The lock held. A second later, the first kick hit the door. Wood splintered near the frame. The sound detonated through the apartment. Claire stumbled backward. Vincent shoved her toward the short hall leading to the bedroom. Go. She did not. Not really. She moved 2 steps, then froze, hand braced against the wall, every nerve lit white with disbelief. The second kick blew the frame inward. The door burst open under the weight of 2 men in dark jackets and gloves, faces set in the flat, cruel focus of people who had come to do harm fast. A third followed behind them, raising something metallic in his hand. The apartment was too small for this kind of violence. That was Claire's first coherent thought. There was nowhere for it to go except into everything. Vincent moved before the first man cleared the threshold. He caught the attacker's wrist, twisted hard, and drove him sideways into the wall by the entry so violently the ceramic key bowl shattered on the floor. Metal rang across the tile. The second man lunged. Vincent turned into him, using the force of his body like a blade, one precise strike to the throat, another to the ribs, then the knife from his ankle was suddenly in his hand, as if it had always been there. Claire's breath locked in her chest. This was not fighting the way movies taught people to expect it. There was no wasted motion, no shouted threats, no dramatic pauses. Just speed, intention, brutal efficiency. One attacker crashed into the coat rack and took it down with him. Another hit the edge of the card table, sending textbooks, pens, and loose notes scattering across the room like frightened birds. The third got his weapon up halfway before Vincent slammed his forearm into the man's jaw and sent him staggering backward into the kitchen counter. A mug fell shattered. Coffee stained one cabinet door in a slow, dark sheet. Claire pressed herself into the hallway wall, hand over her mouth, unable to do anything except watch. One of the men groaned on the floor. Another did not move at all. The third reached inside his jacket. Vincent saw it first. He crossed the room in 2 strides and drove him down hard against the linoleum, forearm across the man's throat knife, flashing once in warning inches from skin. "Who sent you?" The man coughed blood and laughed anyway. It was a terrible sound, wet and broken and proud of itself. "Carbone says hello." The name landed like a switch being thrown. Vincent's face did not change much. That was almost worse. But something in the room did. A pressure, a recognition. The attacker bared his teeth red. Should have finished this years ago. Vincent leaned closer, voice so low Claire barely heard it. "You came to the wrong door." Then he struck once, swift and clean, and the man went limp. Silence fell in pieces after that. Not real silence. The radiator still hissed. Somewhere downstairs a dog started barking at the noise. Rain dripped from the half-broken umbrella stand by the entry. Claire could hear her own pulse roaring in her ears. Vincent stood in the wreckage, breathing hard blood on his hand chest, rising and falling beneath the torn white undershirt she had made him keep on. For one suspended second, he looked less like a man, and more like the aftermath of a storm taking inventory. Then he turned to her. Claire had imagined fear many times in her life. Hospital alarms, late-night streets, empty bank accounts, test results, the phone call when her mother's voice had gone too calm. This was different. This was fear with a body standing in her kitchen. Her apartment looked unrecognizable. The door hung crooked on shattered wood. One dining chair lay on its side. Her flashcards were soaked in muddy shoe prints and blood. The little life she had arranged so carefully around cheap rent and hard work had been split open in less than a minute. "Tell me the truth," she said. Her voice did not shake the first time. It did the second. "Tell me who you are." Vincent wiped his hand once on a dish towel from the counter, though it did nothing useful. He looked at the broken door, at the men on her floor, then back at her. "I run things," he said. Claire laughed once short and disbelieving. "That means nothing. In my world, it means everything." "What world?" His eyes held hers. No flirtation left in them now. No gentleness except the kind it took to stop lying. "The kind built on roots, shipments, leverage, and fear," he said quietly. "The kind respectable people pretend doesn't exist because pretending lets them sleep." Claire felt her knees weaken. She gripped the edge of the hallway table to steady herself. "You're telling me you're what she asked? Some kind of criminal?" A beat passed, then another. "I'm telling you, he said that Anthony Carbone has been trying to take what is mine, and now he knows I came here." The words dropped cold inside her. "What is yours?" He answered without pride, without apology. Just fact. Territory. Men, deals, silence. His gaze moved to the ruined apartment around them. "And now he'll use you to get to me." Claire stared at him. The shape of the last week rearranged itself in brutal clarity. The expensive quiet. The driver with the earpiece. The men in the alley stepping back on sight. The refusal to go to a hospital. The knife at his ankle. The way he observed everything. The way he moved when the door gave way. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew this could happen. I knew it could reach me." "That is not the same thing." His jaw tightened. "No." Something hot and furious rose through the fear. "You came here anyway." "Yes." "Why?" That question struck him harder than the others. She saw it. A fraction, a crack, something human and unguarded passing through his face before discipline covered it again. "Because I had nowhere else I trusted." The anger in her faltered, not gone, just made heavier by the answer. Claire looked at the blood on the floor, at her torn notes, at the men who had broken into her home because a man she barely understood had walked through her door asking for 5 minutes. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, not close enough to matter yet. Vincent heard them too. He crossed to the window and peeled the curtain back 1 inch with 2 fingers. Streetlights washed his profile in pale gold. "They'll send more," he said. Claire found her voice. "Who?" "Carbone. Or men hoping to prove something to him." She looked at the apartment. "What am I supposed to do?" He turned back to her then, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something like regret without disguise. "You can't stay here." The words settled with terrible calm. Claire looked around as if the room itself might argue. The bookshelf tilted against the wall. Glass from the broken mug glittered by the sink. Rain whispered through the crack where the door no longer sealed shut. Every object she owned suddenly looked temporary. "If I leave," she said slowly, "this is over." He did not pretend not to understand. "No," he said, "if you stay, you won't get another choice." A set of headlights swept across the broken doorway from outside, cutting white bars across the walls. Then another. Low engines rolled to a stop at the curb below. Vincent went still, listening. Not fear, assessment. A moment later, there was a coded knock on what remained of the frame. 2 short, 1 long. He moved to the doorway and glanced down the stairwell. When he seemed satisfied, he stepped back. "Those are my men." Claire almost laughed at the absurdity of that sentence in her apartment in her life at 12:30 in the morning with blood drying on her floor. Instead, she crossed to the bedroom in silence and grabbed the first bag she could find. Her backpack. She shoved in her wallet charger, 2 shirts, underwear, her toothbrush, the framed photograph of her mother from the dresser. Then she stopped with both hands on the bedspread, staring down at the open bag as if she had forgotten how to move. Vincent appeared in the doorway, not crowding her, just there. "I'm sorry," he said. It was the wrong thing to say. Claire turned so fast the bag slipped from the bed. "No," she said, anger flaring bright enough to keep the tears back. "No, you don't get to do that. You don't get to walk into my life bleeding and mysterious and kind just enough to matter, then bring this to my door and say you're sorry like that fixes anything." His face stayed still, but she saw him absorb every word. She stepped closer, voice low and shaking now. "I don't even know your real life. I don't know what you do. I don't know who wants you dead. I don't know why I let you in. I just know my apartment is full of blood and strangers because of you. Yes. That one word, quiet and unhidden, broke something open in her. Tears burned suddenly at the backs of her eyes, furious tears she hated on herself. She wiped at them with the heel of her hand. Outside, a car door opened. Voices murmured below. The distant sirens were growing louder now. Vincent glanced once toward the living room, then back to her. Claire. What? We have to go. She laughed again, breathless this time. Of course we do. He waited while she picked up the bag and forced her shaking hands to zip it closed. Then he took it from her without asking, not as a gesture, as logistics. As if carrying weight was the one language he trusted most. They moved through the apartment together. Claire grabbed her phone from the table, her keys from the shattered floor, a sweater from the chair. At the threshold, she stopped and looked back. It was such a small place, too warm in summer, too cold in winter. Pipes that clanked at dawn, windows that leaked, floors that creaked. A kitchen barely bigger than a closet. The first place that had been fully hers after her mother died. Now it looked like the set of some other person's nightmare. Vincent stood beside her in the wrecked doorway, bag in hand, blood drying at his temple. Not touching her. Not asking again. If she stepped out with him, the old life was gone. If she stayed, she would spend the rest of the night waiting for the next kick at the door. Claire drew in one steadying breath and stepped into the hall. The stairwell smelled of damp concrete and cigarette smoke. At the bottom, a black SUV waited at the curb, engine running. Two men in dark coats stood by it, alert and silent. One took in Vincent's condition with a single glance and opened the rear door at once. The other scanned the street in both directions, hand near his jacket. Claire paused under the building awning, the rain cold on the broken edge of the night. Vincent stopped in front of her. "If you get in this car," she said, hearing the truth of it as she spoke, "everything changes." His eyes stayed on hers. Yes, no lie, no comfort, no easy way back offered where none existed. Claire looked at the street, at the shattered glow of city lights on wet pavement, at the apartment windows above where her own dark square waited behind a broken door. Then she looked at the man standing before her, dangerous enough to ruin her life, and honest enough not to hide it now. When she moved, it was with the strange calm of somebody stepping off one shore before the other one is visible. She got into the SUV. Vincent followed. The door shut with a heavy final sound, and the city began to slide away behind them. The city disappeared a little at a time. First, the storefronts gave way to stretches of dark road and shuttered gas stations glowing under hard white lights. Then the highways opened slick with rain, carrying them farther west, while Chicago faded behind them in a blur of red taillights and wet steel. Claire sat in the back seat with her hands locked together in her lap, her backpack at her feet, her pulse still refusing to settle. Vincent sat beside her, one arm braced along the door, the other pressed loosely against the fresh bandage she had taped over his shoulder. He had not said much since they left her apartment. Neither had she. Shock had a way of making language feel unnecessary at first. The driver kept both hands on the wheel. Up front, another man spoke quietly into a phone, relaying clipped updates Claire could not fully follow. Street names, timings, a mention of police scanners, a name she did not recognize. Every sentence sounded like a locked door she had not yet been invited to open. Claire turned her face toward the window. The glass was cold against her temple. Fields and dark tree lines slid past under a sky the color of bruised metal. Somewhere beyond the highway, lightning flashed without thunder, pale and distant. It made the reflection in the window stutter. Her own pale face. Vincent beside her, still and unreadable. The interior of the SUV, like a sealed chamber carrying her out of one life and into another before she had fully understood the cost. After almost an hour, she finally spoke. "Where are we going?" Vincent looked at her. In the dim wash of dashboard light, the bruise at his jaw had deepened to blue-black. He looked exhausted now that the adrenaline had burned off, but it did nothing to soften him. "Galena." Claire frowned. "That's 3 hours away." Closer to 2.5 if the roads stay clear. That is not the part I was commenting on. A shadow of a smile touched his mouth and vanished. The absurdity of that nearly made her angry. You think this is funny? No. Then why are you smiling? Because you're still arguing with me. I'm in a car with men carrying guns because my apartment got broken into by strangers in the middle of the night. Her voice stayed low, but she could feel the heat in it now. I think I've earned the right to argue. You have. Claire let out a breath that caught on the edge of exhaustion. Good. Silence returned, but it shifted a little after that. Less empty. More lived in. A few miles later, the man in the passenger seat turned around. He looked to be in his 40s, broad-shouldered with close-cropped gray at the temples, and the watchful expression of somebody who had stopped being surprised by violence a long time ago. "Roads are clear," he said to Vincent. "No tails." Vincent gave a single nod. The man's gaze flicked to Claire, not unkind, just measuring. "You need anything, miss?" The question was so normal it unsettled her more than the rest. "No." He nodded once and turned back around. "Miss," as if this were a late-night ride to the airport and not the aftermath of a home invasion. Claire leaned back and shut her eyes for a moment. She could still smell the blood from her apartment on her own skin, could still hear the splintering crack of the door giving way. Somewhere deep inside her fear sat cold and coiled, waiting for stillness to become dangerous again. She opened her eyes and looked at Vincent. "You said those men knew you'd been to my apartment." "Yes." "How?" He did not answer immediately. "I was followed." "You let them follow you to me." His jaw tightened. "I lost them once." "That's not the same thing." "No." Claire looked down at her hands. There was a small rust-colored stain near the cuff of her sleeve. His blood. She rubbed at it with her thumb until it only spread thinner. "You keep saying one-word answers like they're going to make this simpler." He watched her for a moment. "They're not for simplicity." "Then what are they for?" "The truth." That lodged somewhere under her ribs in a way she did not appreciate. She wanted to hate him cleanly. The night would have been easier if she could. But anger kept colliding with the memory of him at her kitchen table, bleeding, and asking her almost gently not to take him to a hospital. It collided with the way he had stood between her and the door before it broke. With the fact that he had not lied once after the violence began. Claire turned back toward the window. "I had an exam next week." It was the first thing that came out ridiculous and real. Vincent looked at her, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "You'll still take it." She let out a dry laugh. "Sure, you will." She turned to face him fully now. "You really think the issue here is scheduling? I think you need something that belongs to your life to still exist tomorrow." The answer silenced her. It should not have mattered. It should have sounded hollow coming from a man who had just taken her away from everything familiar. Instead, it sounded like someone speaking carefully around the edge of her panic, not because he understood it fully, but because he recognized its shape. The rain stopped sometime after that. The road narrowed. Streetlights thinned out. By the time they turned off the highway, the dark had gone softer, deeper, less urban. Claire could make out rolling hills, old fences, black stretches of woodland. The kind of darkness city people forgot existed. At last, the SUV turned onto a gravel road lined with pines. The tires crunched slowly forward, headlights washing over trunks and stone and wet leaves. Then the trees opened enough for Claire to see the cabin. It was larger than the word cabin suggested, but not grand. Weathered wood, wide porch, deep eaves, light glowing warm through a handful of windows. The place looked old enough to have survived several owners and too much winter. Safe if you did not look too hard at the black SUV already parked beside it, or the two men standing outside with alert postures and hands near their jackets. The vehicle stopped. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Vincent opened his door and stepped out into the cold. Claire followed, her legs stiff from the drive. The air smelled of pine, damp earth, and chimney smoke. Somewhere in the dark, an insect buzzed once and fell quiet. The stillness of the place felt almost unreal after Chicago. as if the whole world had stepped back a few feet and left only this patch of ground lit and waiting. One of the men on the porch came down the steps at once. He was younger than the others, broad across the chest, his dark hair shaved close at the sides. His attention went straight to Vincent's shoulder. "You should be at a doctor. I've heard that." The man's gaze flicked to Claire. This her. Claire stiffened at the phrasing. Vincent did not look away from the porch. "Watch your mouth, Leo." The rebuke was calm, but it landed hard enough that the man immediately dipped his head. "Sorry." Claire said nothing. She had no idea what to say to men who apologized with the same expression they probably wore while loading weapons. Vincent took her backpack from the rear seat and handed it back to her. "Come inside." The warmth hit her first. The cabin smelled like coffee cedar and the faint buttery scent of something baked earlier and forgotten on a counter. A lamp glowed in the living room beside a stone fireplace burned down to embers. There were boots by the door, a folded blanket over one arm of the couch, a puzzle half finished on the coffee table. For one confused second, Claire thought they had come to the wrong place. Then she saw the pink backpack near the stairs, and the stuffed rabbit tucked beside it. Her eyes moved slowly over the room. A small pair of sneakers by the hearth, crayons in a chipped ceramic mug, a picture on the wall drawn in thick, bright marker, a house, a tree. 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a yellow sun. Claire looked at Vincent. He saw the moment she understood something had shifted. "You have a child." Before he could answer, soft footsteps sounded overhead. A small figure appeared at the top of the staircase. She could not have been older than 8. Dark curls sleep-tousled around her face, one hand rubbing her eye, the other clutching the stuffed rabbit's ear. She wore pale blue pajamas with tiny stars on them and stood on the landing, blinking down into the light, not frightened, just awake enough to know something was wrong. Her gaze found Vincent first. "Daddy." Everything in the room changed. The men near the door seemed suddenly too large. The weapons under jackets too obscene. Even the blood on Vincent's shirt became something impossible against that small voice. He looked up at her, and Claire watched a hardness leave his face that she had not understood he was carrying until it went. "Hey, Bug," he said very softly. The little girl came halfway down the stairs and stopped when she saw Claire. Children noticed everything. Claire knew that from pediatrics. They noticed silence, tension, blood lies, fear. They also noticed who adults became around certain people. This girl looked from Vincent to Claire, then to the bandage at his shoulder, and whatever questions she had stayed behind her eyes a moment longer. "Are you hurt?" she asked him. "I'm all right." She tilted her head in the blunt way only children could. "That's not what I asked." Claire almost smiled despite herself. Vincent actually did. It was brief, tired, and so full of feeling it nearly stopped her breath. "It's not bad," he said. The girl considered that, not fully convinced. Then her gaze shifted to Claire. Claire became aware all at once of how she must look. Hair pulled back in a messy knot. Borrowed panic still clinging to her skin. Yesterday's mascara smudged faintly under her eyes, a stranger standing in a house that clearly meant safety to this child. The girl descended the rest of the steps one careful foot at a time. Up close, she had Vincent's eyes. "Who is she?" she asked. Vincent glanced at Claire, and for the first time since the SUV, uncertainty entered his expression. Not because he feared a room, because he did not know how to place her here. "This is Claire." The child waited, expecting more. When none came, she looked at Claire directly. "Are you hurt?" Claire shook her head. "No." The girl pointed to Vincent's shirt. "He is." "I noticed." That seemed to satisfy her for the moment. Vincent crouched despite the obvious pull in his side and lowered himself to her height. "It's late, Mia." Mia. The name settled into the room as naturally as if Claire had always known it. "You should be asleep," I was Mia said. Then I heard cars. Vincent brushed a curl back from her forehead. The gesture was so gentle Claire had to look away for a second. "Go back upstairs for me." Mia studied him another moment, then looked at Claire again with a solemnity that belonged to somebody older than 8. "Okay," she said, "but she looks cold." Claire blinked. Mia held out the stuffed rabbit. You can borrow him if you want." A laugh almost escaped Claire before she could stop it. A sharp, exhausted little sound. "That's very kind." Mia nodded, as if the matter had been handled properly, turned, and padded back up the stairs. Claire watched until she disappeared down the hall above. Then she turned to Vincent with something like accusation and astonishment tangled together. "You have a daughter." His face closed a little, though not all the way. "Yes. You did not think that was worth mentioning." There wasn't much time. "No, there was just enough time for me to learn men were trying to kill you." The words were sharper than she intended. The child upstairs changed the sound of them. Vincent stood carefully. "You should get some sleep." Claire stared at him. "You cannot possibly think I'm sleeping now." He looked as though he might say something, then let it go. One of the older men entered from the kitchen, carrying a steaming mug. "Tea," he said to Claire. "It's weak, but it's hot." She took it because her hands needed something to do. The man gave Vincent a long look, then glanced toward the stairs. "She go back down?" "Yes." He nodded. "Good." Nobody said out loud what Claire heard underneath it. Good that the child had only seen so much. Good that the night had not reached farther into the house. A woman came in from another room a few minutes later. Silver-haired, compact, wearing a robe over slacks, and the expression of somebody who had raised sons and buried mistakes. She looked at Vincent once unimpressed by his condition, then at Claire with warmer eyes. "I'm Elena," she said. "House manager, cook, occasional executioner of nonsense." She handed Claire a folded stack of clothes. "Bathroom's through there. Clean up, then come eat something before you fall over." Claire opened her mouth to protest she was not hungry, then realized she was too tired to lie convincingly. "Thank you." Elena squeezed her forearm, once brisk and maternal in equal measure. "You can ask questions in the morning. Tonight you need hot water and soup." An hour later, Claire sat at the small kitchen table in borrowed flannel pants and an oversized sweater that smelled faintly of lavender detergent. Steam rose from a bowl of chicken soup in front of her. She had not meant to eat much. She ate all of it. Across the room, Vincent took a phone call in a low voice by the back door, while another man redressed the bandage on his shoulder under Elena's supervision. Outside the kitchen window, the woods stood dark and unmoving. Inside, every corner of the house carried evidence of Mia. Coloring pages held by magnets on the refrigerator. A child-sized cup in the dish rack. Tiny fingerprints low on the glass door to the porch. Nothing about the place fit the image Claire had built of Vincent in her mind. She had pictured penthouses, cold marble, men with dead eyes and velvet ropes and rooms too expensive to touch. Not this. Not soup at 1 a.m. Not a little girl in star pajamas offering her a stuffed rabbit. When the bowl was empty, Elena pointed down the hall. "Guest room, second door. If you need anything, knock on my door, not his." Claire followed the direction without argument. The guest room was simple. Quilt, dresser, lamp with a soft yellow shade. A window looking out over black trees, and the pale seam of moonlight caught between branches. Her backpack sat at the foot of the bed, already placed there by someone while she ate. Claire stood in the middle of the room and let the silence settle. It was too much. Her apartment had always had sound. Pipes, traffic, neighbors. Here the quiet pressed close from all sides. The kind of rural stillness that should have felt peaceful, and instead made her skin prickle because she no longer knew where danger lived. She sat on the edge of the bed and took out the framed photograph of her mother. For a long moment she just held it in both hands, studying the familiar face behind the glass. "You would hate this," she whispered. Then, because there was no one there to hear her, and because she had been holding herself together by her teeth since midnight, Claire bowed her head and cried without making a sound. She did not know how long she sat like that before a knock came at the half-open door. Vincent leaned against the frame shirt, changed now color back in his face, only because exhaustion had turned him pale in a more controlled way. "I didn't mean to wake Mia." Claire wiped quickly at her face and laughed once at herself. "That is somehow the least of tonight." His gaze lingered on her a second too long, not on the tears. on the fact of them, on the vulnerability he had caused and had no simple remedy for. She'll ask questions tomorrow. Will you answer them? As many as I can. Claire looked down at the photograph in her hands, then set it carefully on the nightstand. How old is she? 8. She seems older. She's had practice. That answer hurt in ways she had not expected. Claire looked back at him. Does she know what you do? Vincent's expression changed not with anger, but with an old weariness. She knows men listen when I speak. She knows some people are dangerous. She knows I don't let lies into this house if I can help it. If you can help it. His jaw shifted. I don't tell her things a child should never carry. Claire stood and crossed the room, stopping a few feet from him. And what exactly am I carrying now? The question hung there between them. Moonlight touched one side of his face through the hallway window. It made the bruise at his jaw look almost silver. Too much, he said quietly. The honesty of it stole the anger from her again. They stood in silence for a moment, two people too awake for the hour and too changed by the night to pretend otherwise. Then Claire asked the question she had been circling since the staircase. Mia's mother. Vincent's gaze dropped for the first time. Dead. There was no theatrical pause around the word, just impact. Claire waited. He looked past her shoulder somewhere into the dark of the guest room, where old pain apparently lived with more permanence than furniture. 3 years ago, he said. A car bomb in Cicero. She wasn't supposed to be there. Claire's hand tightened around the bedpost beside her. It was meant for you. Yes, the room seemed to shrink around that truth. Vincent did not dress it up. He did not ask for absolution. He simply stood there wearing the fact like a scar he had learned not to touch. Claire thought of Mia in the blue pajamas, of the stuffed rabbit, of the solemn eyes that had gone first to his wound and then to Claire's face, already measuring whether the adults in the room could be trusted to hold the world together. That's why you keep everyone at a distance, she said. A humorless shadow moved through his expression. Distance is cleaner than funerals. For a second, the words seemed to strip him down to something frighteningly human. Claire had spent so much time trying to understand the dangerous man that she had not expected to find grief standing at the center of him, old and burning low. She should have stepped back. Instead, she said very softly, "That sounds lonely." Vincent looked at her then with an intensity that made the air feel thinner. It is. The truth of that landed between them with no room left to dodge it. Claire's throat tightened. She did not know whether she wanted to comfort him or shake him, or tell him to leave the room before she forgot every rational thing she still owed herself. So she chose the safest sentence she had left. You should sleep. A faint breath almost passed for a laugh. You first. He pushed off the doorframe and left her with that. The next morning broke cold and bright. Claire woke to the smell of coffee and something sweet baking downstairs. For one disoriented second, she did not know where she was. Then the pine outside the window, the quilt, the silence, and the weight of yesterday dropped back into place. She dressed in the clothes she had packed and followed the sounds to the kitchen. Mia sat at the table, coloring with grave concentration a bowl of cereal untouched in front of her. Sunlight poured through the windows and turned her curls gold at the edges. When she looked up and saw Claire, her face opened in immediate recognition, unguarded and curious. You stayed. Claire smiled before she could stop herself. I did. Mia nodded, as if this confirmed something important. Elena says you know first aid. I know a little more than that. Daddy hates first aid. From the stove, Elena snorted. Your father hates being told what to do by women with common sense. There's a difference. Mia accepted that with the solemnity of a child receiving family history. Vincent walked in from the back porch at that moment, coat unbuttoned, phone in hand, morning air still clinging to him. His eyes found Claire at once. Then Mia. The look he gave his daughter was different from the one he gave the rest of the world. Less guarded. More expensive. Eat your cereal, he told her. Mia pointed her spoon at his shoulder. Did Claire fix you? Vincent glanced at Claire. She helped. Mia looked pleased by this. Good, you bleed on everything. Claire choked on a laugh into her coffee. The day settled into an uneasy rhythm after that. Men came and went from the porch. Phones rang. Low voices passed through rooms and stopped when Claire entered, then slowly stopped stopping. She changed Vincent's bandage in the afternoon in the small laundry room because it had the best light. He sat on a wooden chair while she peeled away the dressing and checked the stitches, trying not to notice the warmth of his skin or the way he watched her hands. "You should keep the arms still," she said. "I am." "You are absolutely not." His mouth curved. "You're very demanding for a guest. You're very ungrateful for a patient." He looked at her with that quiet intensity again. No, not that. The answer hit lower than she was prepared for. She looked down at the fresh gauze, focused on the work, and ignored the sudden unsteadiness in her breathing. That evening, Mia insisted Claire help her with a puzzle on the living room floor. Vincent took a call by the fireplace, speaking in a low voice Claire tried and failed not to follow. Territory, docks, Carbone. The names fell like stones into a pond she was already standing too close to. By the time the sky went dark, the cabin felt less like a hiding place and more like a fragile version of ordinary. 3 plates on the table. Mia yawning over dessert. Elena muttering about men ruining good kitchens with bad timing. Claire catching Vincent watching her across the room and looking away too slowly. Then, just as the fire burned low and Mia had been sent upstairs with her rabbit tucked under one arm, a crack split the night outside. Not thunder, gunfire. The front window exploded inward in a spray of glass. Elena shouted. One of Vincent's men lunged for the lights. Mia screamed from upstairs. Vincent was already moving. Claire. Her body reacted before thought did. He shoved a gun into Leo's hand, another order to someone by the back door, then caught Claire by the shoulders and looked at her with a focus so sharp it cut through the chaos at once. "Get Mia." More shots tore through the siding. Wood splintered near the doorframe. Claire ran. Up the stairs, 2 at a time, heart pounding so hard she could barely hear anything else. Mia stood in the hall outside her room, white-faced and trembling, rabbit clutched to her chest. Claire dropped to her knees and gathered the girl against her. "I've got you." Downstairs, men were shouting. Another window burst. The cabin shuddered under the violence of it. Mia buried her face in Claire's shoulder. "What's happening?" Claire's voice came out steadier than she felt. "Your father is taking care of it." She carried Mia into the bedroom and crouched behind the heavy dresser near the interior wall, wrapping both arms around her, while the sounds of breaking glass and gunfire shook the house around them. Down below, in the storm of splintering wood and shouted names, Vincent DeLuca stopped being the man from the coffee shop entirely. Claire heard it before she saw it. The rhythm of movement. The hard crash of bodies against furniture. A voice she recognized cutting through the chaos in short, precise commands. Men answered him without hesitation. The cabin seemed to tighten around that voice, every room bending toward it. Mia shook in Claire's arms. Claire kept one hand at the back of the little girl's head and the other over the rabbit pressed between them as if the softness of it might somehow hold the walls together. "It's okay," she whispered, though even to her own ears the words sounded thin. "Stay down. Stay with me." A boot struck something in the hallway below. Glass burst again. Then the sounds changed. Less invasion, more resistance. The sharp pounding of footsteps moving toward the back of the house. A man cried out. Another voice cursed. Then, after a stretch of noise so violent it seemed to erase time, the gunfire stopped. Silence did not fall all at once. It arrived in fragments. A groan downstairs. The crackle of the fire in the stone hearth. Mia's ragged breathing against Claire's shoulder. Somewhere outside, a car engine revved and then tore away down the gravel road. Claire stayed where she was for another few seconds, every muscle locked tight, listening for the next rupture. Instead, she heard Vincent calling her name. Not loudly. He did not need to. She rose too fast, one hand braced on the dresser as the room tilted. Mia clung to her as they crossed the hall and came to the top of the stairs. The cabin looked as if a storm had passed through it and chosen only the things human hands had made. The front window was gone. One lamp lay shattered beside the couch. A dining chair had been knocked clear across the room. Cold night air moved through the opening where glass had been carrying the smells of pine-wet dirt and gunpowder. Two of Vincent's men were checking the perimeter through the broken frame. Leo stood by the kitchen island with blood on one sleeve that did not look like his. Elena knelt beside another man at the foot of the stairs, pressing a dish towel to his leg while muttering furious instructions under her breath. And Vincent stood near the doorway, chest rising and falling, shirt torn at the shoulder again, his face cut along one cheekbone where flying glass had kissed him on the way through. The moment he saw Mia, something in his expression shifted. Claire carried the child down the last few steps. Mia let go of Claire and ran to him. He dropped to one knee, despite the pull in his side, and caught her against him with one arm, the other hand cradling the back of her head as if he could shield her from everything he had already failed to keep outside. "You okay, bug?" Mia nodded into his neck, then shook her head, which made Claire's throat tighten unexpectedly. Vincent pressed his mouth to the top of her hair. His eyes lifted to Claire over Mia's shoulder. Not relief exactly. Relief was too simple for what moved across his face. Recognition, maybe. That Claire had done exactly what he asked. That when the house broke open she had not frozen and she had not run. Leo came over a second later, breathing hard. 3 outside. 2 got clear before we could cut them off. Plate. One of the SUVs didn't have one. The truck did. Vincent stood slowly, Mia still tucked close against him. "Call Mateo. Tell him I want every road cam between here and Stockton pulled in the next hour." Leo nodded and moved away. Claire looked around the room again. "Is everyone alive?" Elena glanced up from the wounded man on the floor. "Depends how dramatic he feels like being." The man hissed through his teeth as she tightened the makeshift bandage. "I got shot. You got grazed. Don't flatter yourself." Despite everything, Claire nearly laughed. Then her training caught up with the scene. She crossed the room at once and crouched beside Elena. "Move the towel." Elena did, and Claire leaned in. Not a graze. Not deep enough to kill quickly, but not shallow either. Flesh torn along the outer thigh. A lot of blood because thighs always looked worse than they were, but enough risk to matter. "We need pressure higher up," Claire said. "And something cleaner than this." Elena looked offended. "It was clean when I took it off the line." Claire met her eyes. "Please." That softened it. A moment later, Leo appeared with gauze packets alcohol and a first aid case that looked military rather than domestic. Claire worked fast. Pressure. Elevation. Reassurance without lying. The injured man was pale under his stubble, but lucid, swearing in 2 languages while she wrapped the wound tighter. Across the room, Vincent had not let Mia go. He carried her into the kitchen and set her on a stool away from the broken glass. He checked her arms, her face, the back of her head, as if he needed to prove with his own hands that no stray piece of the night had made it through to her skin. Claire looked up once while securing the bandage and caught the exact moment his hand trembled. It lasted less than a second. Nobody else seemed to see it. But she did, and it told her more than all the guns in the cabin had. An hour later, the house was as settled as it was going to get. The broken window had been covered with plywood from the shed. A replacement lamp glowed on the side table. Elena had gotten Mia back upstairs with warm milk and promises she did not have to keep about the rest of the night being quiet. The injured man had been moved to the downstairs guest room, where he cursed less now and snored more. The men on watch rotated in pairs outside, and Claire stood at the kitchen sink washing blood from her hands that was not her own. The water ran pink then clear. Vincent came in behind her footsteps, almost silent on the wood floor despite the hour and the injuries and the weight he carried in every room. She felt him before she turned. Something in the air changed when he entered. The house seemed to organize itself around his presence, but here in the kitchen under the yellow light and the quiet hum of the refrigerator he looked less like power and more like a man running on the last of his restraint. "You should be resting," he said. Claire shut off the tap. "You should try saying something original." A faint line touched his mouth and was gone. She dried her hands on a towel and turned to face him fully. Up close, the cut on his cheekbone had clotted dark. A bruise had started along the left side of his neck. His right hand bore fresh swelling over the knuckles' skin, split in 2 places. He looked held together by adrenaline and habit. "You're bleeding again. It's nothing. That has lost all meaning when you say it." He leaned one shoulder against the counter and watched her for a moment. "Mia told me you stayed with her." Claire felt irritation rise simply because it was easier than the other things. "Where exactly did you think I was going to go?" His gaze did not leave hers. "A lot of people run when things turn ugly." She folded the towel once, then again. "I'm not a lot of people." "No," he said quietly, "you're not." The sentence landed too hard in the soft middle of her. Claire set the towel down and crossed to the small medicine cabinet Elena had raided earlier. "Sit." Vincent did not move. She looked over her shoulder. "I was not making conversation." He gave her that almost smile again, the one that seemed to surprise him as much as it did anyone else, then pulled out a chair and sat. Claire cleaned the cut at his cheekbone first. He did not flinch this time, which told her he was more tired than proud. She worked in silence for a minute, close enough to smell smoke in the fabric of his shirt and cedar in the skin at his throat. "When were you going to tell me this wasn't over?" she asked. His eyes lifted to hers. "I didn't know how long it would stay quiet." "That wasn't what I asked." "No." Claire dabbed at the cut with a little more force than necessary. "You keep doing that." "Doing what?" "Answering the part of the question that hurts you least." Something passed through his face, then brief but real. Weariness. Maybe honesty trying to decide whether it had the stamina for one more round. "He's pushing harder because of you," Vincent said. Claire's hand stilled. "Carbone." "Yes, because he thinks I matter to you." The silence after that felt almost intimate in its bluntness. Vincent looked past her shoulder toward the dark window over the sink. "He thinks anything that reaches inside my house becomes leverage." "Does he know about Mia?" His jaw tightened. "He knows enough." A chill moved through Claire so sharp it left her momentarily breathless. "And you still thought I should stay here?" "I thought this was the safest place I had." "That is not comforting." "It wasn't meant to be." She stepped back and capped the antiseptic bottle with shaking fingers she hoped he did not notice. "You need a better plan than waiting for men to show up at your doors." He leaned forward, forearms braced on his thighs, eyes shadowed under the kitchen light. "I'm working on one." "No, you're reacting. Those are different things." Vincent looked up at her slowly. Claire felt heat rise in her face, but she did not take the words back. "At my apartment, you were bleeding and followed. Tonight, they got to the cabin. You keep saying you know this world, but from where I'm standing, it looks like he keeps deciding the terms." For a moment, she thought he might shut down. Shut her out the way powerful men did when truth arrived in a voice they had not granted permission to use. Instead, he asked very quietly, "And from where you're standing, what should I be doing?" It was not mockery. That almost unnerved her more than anger would have. Claire glanced toward the dining table in the adjoining room. Papers had been spread across it earlier in the evening before the attack. Maps, folders, phones, names she had no context for. Systems, routes, pressure points. She knew systems. Not crime, not territories. But systems, yes. "Show me." Vincent studied her face as if weighing the danger of that request against the danger of refusing it. Then he rose and gestured towards the dining room. "All right." The maps covered nearly the entire table. Chicago and the western suburbs in layered printouts. Freight routes. Port access. Warehouse locations. Handwritten notes in tight block letters. Several photographs paper-clipped to corners. Men in dark coats. License plates. A row of shipping containers at some industrial lot by the river. Claire stood at the edge of it all while Vincent moved to the opposite side and placed both hands flat on the wood. "This is Carbone's remaining distribution network," he said. "What's left after the South Loop seizure and what I took off him in Cicero last winter." The words meant almost nothing to Claire until he pointed. "These routes are food import, legit on paper, dirty in practice. cash contraband leverage. This is where he still has reach. She leaned over the maps. There was a logic to them. Not moral, not legal, but structural. Bottlenecks, redundancies, routes that branched and rejoined like circulatory systems. She had spent 2 years learning to think in systems of flow-pressure breakdown response. Hospital floors worked that way. Supply chains worked that way. Human bodies certainly did. "What does he need most?" she asked. Vincent did not hesitate. Control. No, not emotionally, operationally. His brows drew together. She pointed to 3 marked locations on the map. If this road is compromised and this one is under surveillance, why are these 2 still active? Because they're the cleanest on paper. Then why hit the cabin tonight instead of protecting them? Vincent's gaze followed her finger. Leo, leaning in the doorway now with a fresh cup of coffee, went quiet. Claire traced a line from a warehouse near Aurora back toward the city, then west again. He isn't coming from everywhere. He's funneling. Vincent stepped closer to the table. "Explain." She swallowed. Men like him did not ask for explanations unless they intended to use them. These routes converge too often to be redundancy. It's concentration. He's shrinking the network and hardening the center. Her finger stopped on a circled point near the lakefront. This is the piece he can't lose. Leo moved around the table. Navy Pier Freight Access. Vincent looked at him. "You were told that contract was dormant." Leo's mouth flattened. "I was lied to." Claire glanced between them. Whatever this is, it's where he thinks he can still move product without losing face. If he's hitting soft targets and retreating fast, he's buying time for something he hasn't moved yet. The room stayed still for a beat. Then Vincent leaned back a fraction and looked at her in a way she had not seen before. Not protective. Not merely attentive. Evaluating, yes, but with a dawning respect that reached deeper than surprise. "You see patterns fast," he said. Claire straightened. "I see systems under stress. That's basically nursing." Leo let out one short breath that might have been a laugh. "Remind me never to lie to a nurse." Vincent ignored him. His eyes remained on Claire. "He'll use the docks. Then stop waiting for him to find you." The sentence hung in the room. No one said anything for a second. Then Vincent turned to Leo. "Wake Mateo. Pull every camera feed within 2 miles of the pier. I want every truck that crossed there after midnight in the last week." Leo nodded once and was already moving. Claire became suddenly aware of how close Vincent stood on the opposite side of the table. Of the fact that he had listened. Really listened. In his world, that probably meant more than apology ever could. She should have felt satisfaction. Instead, she felt the dangerous warmth of being let in. By morning, the cabin had become an operations room disguised as a house. Phones rang constantly. Men arrived with laptops, hard drives, and folded jackets damp from the road. Elena fed them all, as if she refused to let violence interfere with proper meals. Mia stayed mostly upstairs with coloring books and a movie, though every so often she wandered down to ask whether Claire would braid her hair or whether her father was done shouting into telephones yet. Claire moved where she was useful. She restocked the medical supplies, rebandaged the wounded man's leg when it bled through, made Mia eat a real lunch, passed coffee to men who looked like they had forgotten how exhaustion worked. And when Vincent's Lieutenant Mateo arrived with a split lip and a drive full of surveillance footage, she sat beside him for 2 hours, scanning timestamps and plate numbers until her eyes burned. Nobody told her to leave the table. Nobody called her sweetheart or miss by noon. They asked what she saw. That changed the air more than she expected. Late that afternoon, one of the younger men staggered in from the porch, pale and sweating, insisting he was fine. Claire took one look and said, "He's not." Vincent turned from the map wall immediately. The man had taken a blow to the side during the cabin attack and hidden it well enough overnight. Too well. Now his speech was just a fraction slow, and one pupil sat a touch larger than the other. Concussion, Claire thought, maybe worse. She had him down on the couch before he could protest, checked his eyes, his coordination, his recall. Elena brought ice. Mateo called ahead to a private clinic 40 miles south that apparently asked no questions if Vincent paid enough. When the vehicle left with the young man in the back and orders to call every 20 minutes, the room looked at Claire differently. Not because she had done something dramatic, because she had seen what they had missed. Vincent crossed to her afterward while she stood by the fireplace washing her hands with sanitizer that smelled sharply of lemon and alcohol. "You caught that fast." He was compensating. He'd been trying to hide it for hours. Claire rubbed her palms together until they were dry. A lot of men think pretending not to feel pain counts as strength. He looked at her for a long moment. "And what do you think counts?" The answer came before she could soften it. "Coming back alive." Something in his face tightened at that. He understood exactly what she meant. By evening, they had enough to confirm what Claire had seen. 3 shipments through the Navy Pier freight entrance in 6 days. 2 shell vendors connected to old Carbone money. 1 expected movement in 48 hours. Maybe less. Vincent stood in the living room near the fire, gone low hands in his pockets, staring at the marked map as if it had personally insulted him. Claire leaned in the doorway, watching him. "You're going to go after him there." It was not a question. He did not deny it. "He'll come if I force the issue." "You say that like you want him to." His gaze stayed on the map. "I want this done." "That is also not the same thing." At last he looked at her. The room had emptied slowly over the last hour. Elena had taken Mia upstairs. Leo and Mateo were outside on calls. For the first time all day, the cabin felt briefly private again. Vincent crossed to the side table, picked up a lowball glass, thought better of it, set it back down, untouched. "As long as Carbone breathes, he'll keep reaching," he said. "He'll keep finding cracks. He'll keep testing what he can take from me." Claire stepped farther into the room. "And if you go in angry, he gets exactly the version of you he wants." A humorless edge touched his mouth. "You think you know him already." "I think I know men who confuse vengeance with control." He let out a breath through his nose. "Claire." "No?" "Listen to me." She moved until she stood only a few feet from him, close enough to see how fatigue had darkened the skin beneath his eyes. "At the apartment, at the cabin, every time he pushes you answer with force. Fine. Maybe that's your world. But last night with Mia in the house, all I could think was that if you keep fighting like a man with nothing left to lose one day, that's exactly what you'll have." He went very still. The fire cracked softly behind him. Claire felt her own heartbeat in the silence that followed. "You don't get to disappear into this and call it protection." His voice when it came was low. "You think I don't know what I'm risking? I think you know it so well you've started treating it like fate." That landed. She saw it. Not because he flinched. Men like Vincent did not flinch where anyone could see. But the set of his shoulders changed by a fraction, as if some internal brace had taken a hit. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he stepped closer. Not enough to touch. Enough that she had to tip her chin up a little to keep holding his gaze. "You should have walked away when you still could," he said. Claire's throat tightened. "That chance disappeared with my front door." A long silence stretched between them, dense with things neither of them had named cleanly, and both of them had already felt too much. Finally, Vincent lifted one hand, hesitated, then tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, with a tenderness so restrained it nearly undid her. "I know," he said. The touch did not last. That was somehow worse. Claire's breath went unsteady. "Then stop shutting me out." Something in him gave way enough for truth to get through. "I don't know how to do this with you in the middle of it. You don't get to decide that by yourself." His eyes searched hers not for weakness now, but for certainty. She gave it to him. No trembling, no apology. Just the truth of a woman too far inside the storm to pretend she was still standing on the porch. At last he nodded once. All right. The word moved through her like a struck match. They spent the next day preparing. Not with speeches. Not with romance made easy by danger. With lists, schedules, practical things. Mia's overnight bag packed in case Elena had to move her fast. Alternate routes marked from the cabin to the county road. Phones charged. Vehicles rotated. Claire assembled medical kits in plastic bins and labeled them in thick black marker because chaos had a way of swallowing unlabeled things first. Vincent watched her once while she knelt on the floor, taping gauze to the inside lid of one case. "You do this under pressure too well." She looked up. "I wish that were a compliment." "It is." "No, it's history." He did not ask which history. That was one of the few kindnesses he gave without announcing them. Just before sunset, Mia found Claire on the back porch and held up a drawing. A house with a yellow door. 3 stick figures holding hands in front of it. The tallest one had dark hair. The smallest one held a rabbit. Claire swallowed around the sudden ache in her throat. "It's beautiful." Mia nodded, satisfied. "I made your hair too long, but I fixed it." "My hair, not your hair." Claire looked toward the yard where Vincent stood with Leo near the vehicles, head bent over a phone profile cut dark against the falling light. A man built for command and damage and choices too expensive for anyone else in the room. When he glanced up and saw them watching, his gaze rested on Claire for a beat longer than it should have. Later, after Mia was asleep and the house had gone quiet in that tense, held-breath way it did before action, Vincent found Claire in the mudroom, pulling on her coat. His expression hardened immediately. "No." Claire looked up from the zipper. "That's not an argument. You're not coming to the docks. I'm not staying here while you walk into a trap." "It's not a trap." "Then why do you have 3 backup vehicles and 4 men posted before the driveway?" He stepped inside and shut the mudroom door behind him, lowering his voice. "Because I plan for bad outcomes." "So do I. This isn't the same." Claire lifted her chin. "No, it isn't. Because if something goes wrong, I'm done waiting for someone to tell me after the blood dries." They stood a foot apart, the small room full of winter coats and boots, and the heat of 2 stubborn people who had already lost the luxury of pretending distance was still possible. Vincent's hands curled once at his sides. "You're not safe there." "I'm not safe here if he wins." He closed his eyes for half a second, then opened them with the look of a man trying not to be split in two by equally impossible truths. "Claire." She stepped closer. "Fight like a man who plans to come home." The words were barely louder than breath, but they hit him with visible force. She saw it in the way his jaw shifted, in the way his eyes went darker, not with anger, but with feeling he had not given himself permission to show. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than before. "Stay with Elena and Mia until I send for you." "No." He stared at her. Claire held his gaze. "Together, Vincent. You said yes." For a long moment, the room contained only the sound of both of them breathing. Then, very slowly, he nodded. Not agreement in principle. Surrender to fact. "All right," he said. "You stay in the second vehicle. You do exactly what Leo says. And if anything shifts, you leave." No argument. Claire should have promised. Instead, she said, "I'll do what keeps us alive." His mouth almost curved despite himself. That is not reassuring. It's honest. He looked at her the way he had in the restaurant that first night, as if some part of him still could not believe the shape of the woman standing in front of him. Then he reached for the mudroom shelf, took the medical bag she had packed, and handed it to her. Outside, engines were already turning over in the dark. The convoy left just after dawn. The sky over Galena had not fully decided what kind of morning it wanted to be. The horizon held a pale strip of light behind the pines, but the air still carried the cold blue hush of night. Frost silvered the gravel at the edge of the drive. Breath rose white from the mouths of the men checking vehicles one last time. Claire climbed into the second SUV with the medical bag at her feet, and her pulse moving too fast to belong to someone sitting still. Leo took the front passenger seat. Mateo drove. Neither of them spoke much once the vehicles pulled onto the county road. In the back seat beside Claire, the city felt impossibly far away, and already too close. She had left Mia asleep upstairs with Elena, one hand tucked beneath her cheek, the stuffed rabbit crushed against her ribs. Claire had stood in the doorway for a moment longer than she should have, memorizing the shape of the child in the quilt softened by dawn. Vincent had not rushed her. He had only waited at the base of the stairs with that grave stillness he wore when feeling too much and saying too little were happening at the same time. Now, as the convoy cut east through the morning dark, Claire kept seeing Mia's drawing in her mind. The yellow door, the three figures. The future a child had sketched with the confidence adults rarely dared. Headlights carved tunnels through the cold. The farther they drove, the more the roads thickened. Farm fields gave way to industrial edges, then strip malls, then the long, concrete veins that fed Chicago back into itself. By the time the skyline rose ahead through a gray wash of lake cloud, the cabin already felt like a different lifetime. Leo turned halfway in his seat. "You stay inside the vehicle unless I tell you otherwise." Claire looked at him. "You've said that twice. I'll say it 12 more if it keeps you in one piece." It was the closest thing to warmth she had heard from him. Mateo checked the mirrors. First vehicle is 2 blocks ahead. Claire looked through the windshield. The city opened around them in steel and wet light. Delivery trucks. Smoke from rooftop vents. Pedestrians with collars up against the wind moving through a morning that had no idea what kind of violence was threading itself under the surface. Her phone buzzed once in her coat pocket. A message from Elena. "Mia asked if you braid hair better than cartoons. Come back alive so I can tell her yes." Claire stared at the screen until the letters blurred, then locked the phone and slipped it away. The convoy did not go straight to the pier. Vincent had changed the approach at the last moment after a call from one of his men posted near the freight entrance. Too many eyes, too many bodies in the wrong places for an operation that was supposed to be half dormant. So they looped south, first cut through the river roads, and took cover in an abandoned loading yard 4 blocks inland from the lake. The first SUV was already there when they pulled in. Vincent stood outside it with his coat open and a phone pressed to his ear, one hand braced on the roof. The wind off the water moved through his hair and flattened the dark fabric of his shirt against his body. He turned as the second vehicle stopped. For a moment, all he did was look at Claire through the glass. Not possessive, not panicked, just a long measuring look that said he still hated the fact that she was here and had already accepted that he would rather have her within sight than left behind to imagine worse. Claire stepped out before Leo could open her door. The loading yard smelled of salt diesel and old rust. A line of stacked shipping pallets cast long shadows beside a brick wall tagged with layers of graffiti. Somewhere nearby, metal clanged in a rhythm that sounded industrial and indifferent. Vincent ended the call and crossed to them. "You stay behind cover once we move," he said. Claire slid the strap of the medical bag higher on her shoulder. "You have to stop opening every conversation like I'm not listening." His gaze dropped to the bag, then rose back to her face. "That thing is for after. It's for when someone starts bleeding. Same thing." He looked tired. Not in the blunt, physical sense. Tired in a way that sat deeper in the face and made every decision look like it weighed a little more than it should. Claire had seen that look in residents at the end of 30-hour shifts and in daughters sitting beside hospice beds. It was the look of somebody keeping a promise to remain standing long after the body had offered several reasonable objections. Mateo approached with a tablet in hand. Movement confirmed. 2 box trucks came in through the east gate 20 minutes ago. Carbone's men on the upper walks and the south fence. More inside the storage bay. Vincent took the tablet. "Carbone, not seen yet." "He's here," Leo said. "He likes audience for this kind of thing." Claire looked toward the skyline beyond the loading yard. Beyond that, beyond concrete and river and steel, the lake waited cold and enormous. The whole city seemed to be holding its breath without knowing why. Vincent handed the tablet back to Mateo. "We split at the rail access. Leo with me. Mateo takes the back service road. Nobody fires until I say so unless they fire first." Claire watched the men nod. This was the part of his life no one outside it ever really understood. Not the guns, not the money, the obedience. The way other men aligned themselves around one person's judgment as if it were the difference between survival and burial. Maybe it was. Vincent turned to Claire one last time before moving. If the line breaks, you leave with Mateo. Claire held his gaze. And if you go down, something hard and unguarded moved in his face. That isn't the line. It is for me. For one dangerous second, she thought he might touch her. He did not. His control held, but only just. Then he leaned closer, voice low enough that only she could hear it above the wind. I plan to come home. The words did something to her chest she could not afford right then. He stepped back, checked the weapon at his side, and the softness was gone from him again. They moved out. Claire stayed with the second vehicle at first, crouched behind stacked pallets with one of Mateo's men, while the others slipped along the broken edge of the yard toward the freight district. Through gaps in the wood, she could see only flashes. A chain-link fence. The rear corner of a warehouse. The steel ribs of an overhead catwalk crossing from one building to another like a bridge between bad decisions. Then the first shot cracked the air open. It came from above. A muzzle flash flared on the catwalk, sharp and bright against the gray morning. One of Vincent's men dropped behind a concrete barrier and answered with 2 clean shots. Shouting erupted from inside the freight bay. Doors slammed. Engines roared awake somewhere deeper in the complex. And just like that, the yard turned into war. Claire had thought she understood adrenaline after clinical emergencies. She had not like this. This was faster and more lawless. Her body moved before her mind could catch up, flattening lower behind the pallets as bullets struck metal somewhere close enough to throw sparks through the air. Mateo shouted into his radio from behind a tow truck. Leo disappeared through a side opening in the warehouse with 3 men behind him. The whole structure echoed with gunfire footsteps and the hollow thunder of heavy doors being thrown back. Claire tightened one hand around the strap of the medical bag and forced herself to breathe. A man staggered out of the side entrance, clutching his shoulder, blood spreading fast through his fingers. One of Vincent's crew hauled him behind cover and called for bandages. Claire was moving before anyone gave permission. She slid the last few feet on one knee beside the wounded man, dropped the bag, and pulled gauze free with hands that had learned steadiness through repetition and necessity. Move your hand. He obeyed because pain made everyone honest. The wound was through muscle ugly but survivable. She packed pressure into it, wrapped tight, checked his color, checked his eyes, shouted for him to stay awake even when he swore at her for sounding like a textbook. The man, blinking down at her, looked almost offended by how little she cared about his pride. Another burst of gunfire rattled through the bay. Mateo crouched near them and pointed toward the interior corridor. Carbone's pulling back to the north side. Then why are we still here? Claire shot back. Mateo stared at her a beat, then barked into the radio north side. No one questioned why he repeated it. Claire rose and moved with them deeper inside the freight building. The place smelled of cold concrete machine oil and lake damp. Stacks of crates rose in rows under hanging industrial lights. A forklift sat abandoned in the middle aisle. Footsteps echoed above on the catwalks. Somewhere to the right a man screamed once and stopped. Claire kept low, following the line of bodies and cover, while trying not to think about the fact that every angle around her was a place bullets could come from. She saw Vincent only in fragments at first. A dark coat slipping around a support pillar, the unmistakable authority in his voice cutting through the noise. One hand lifted in a signal, and 4 men shifting at once because he had asked them to with nothing more than a glance. Then she saw him clearly at the end of the central aisle. Anthony Carbone stood on an elevated loading platform with 2 men beside him, and the careless posture of someone who believed other people's fear was an inheritance he could cash forever. He was older than Vincent by at least 20 years. Silver hair cut close, heavy wool coat buttoned to the throat. One hand resting on a cane that looked more decorative than necessary. The kind of man who had survived long enough to start confusing his own mythology with the truth. Even at a distance, his smile looked cruel. "So, this is what you dragged me out for, Carbone," called over the gunfire and echoing steel. A shipping dispute and a woman. Vincent stepped into the open just enough to be seen. Claire felt the breath lock in her throat. "Leave them out of this," he said. Carbone laughed, and the sound made something in her skin crawl. You brought them in when you forgot the difference between appetite and weakness. The men beside him opened fire. Vincent moved back into cover a fraction too late. A round clipped the steel beam where his head had been showering sparks down in a bright, brief cascade. Leo and two others returned fire from the left side aisle. One of Carbone's men went down hard against the rail and disappeared from sight. The fight shifted upward after that. Catwalks, stairs, angles of sight that kept opening and closing too fast for Claire to follow. She stayed low behind a crate stack with the medical bag open, and her heart pounding hard enough to blur the edges of sound. Then Mateo swore. Truck. Claire looked where he was looking. One of the box trucks at the far loading bay had started moving. Not away from the fighting, toward the side gate, toward escape. Is he running? She asked. Mateo's face hardened. He's moving the last shipment. A second later, Vincent saw it too. He shouted something Claire could not hear and broke from cover, cutting across the central floor toward the bay door as bullets snapped around him. Leo cursed and followed. Two men peeled off after them. Carbone himself disappeared from the platform. The truck roared out through the north gate. By the time the others reached vehicles, Claire was already in the back seat of Mateo's SUV, the medical bag beside her, and every nerve in her body screaming that this was exactly how bad decisions began. No one told her to get out. The chase cut north along the river roads, all wet asphalt and warehouse walls, and traffic breaking wide in fear as the convoy forced its way through. The fleeing truck fishtailed once at an intersection, recovered, then barreled toward the South Branch Industrial District where old brick loading buildings sat half abandoned and half repurposed for businesses too vague to describe cleanly on tax forms. Claire gripped the seat in front of her so hard her fingers ached. Where is he going? Mateo's answer came through clenched teeth. Last stronghold. The truck smashed through a chain gate and disappeared into the lot of an old river warehouse. They were on it seconds later. The building rose out of the gray afternoon like a ruin dressed up as power. Floodlights mounted over the loading bays. Trucks parked crosswise to block easy exit. Men with weapons moving between stacks of pallets and concrete pillars. Carbone had prepared for this place. Maybe always intended to end here. Mateo braked hard behind a line of derelict vans. Stay down. Claire barely heard him. Across the lot, Vincent stepped out of the lead SUV into wind smoke and the kind of stillness that lives one breath before mass violence. His coat snapped once behind him. Blood had dried dark on the side of his neck from the freight yard, but he moved as if injury belonged to other people. Carbone emerged from the warehouse entry above the main loading ramp. So the king finally leaves his corner, he called. The voice carried over concrete and river water and the low grind of idling engines. Vincent's answer cut through the lot like a blade. It ends tonight. Carbone rested both hands on the head of his cane and smiled down at him. You think a woman and a child made you stronger. They only made you slower. Claire felt the words like a slap even from that distance. She reached for the door handle before she had fully decided to. Mateo grabbed her wrist. No, his flank is open. So is yours. In the lot ahead, gunfire erupted again. Men scattered to cover. The front windows of the warehouse shattered outward. A truck tire blew with a concussive bang that rang through Claire's teeth. Vincent's people pushed left and right in a split line trying to box the entrance while Carbone's men answered from the upper windows and the stacked crates along the loading dock. Smoke started somewhere near the rear ramp, thin at first, then thicker. Claire ducked lower as bullets hit the van chassis with brutal metallic jolts. Her breath came quick and shallow. The medical bag sat useless in her lap because there was no safe route yet to anyone bleeding. Then she saw movement near the passenger side mirror. Not Vincent, not Leo. Carbone. He had slipped the main line and was circling along the vehicles using the smoke and noise to cut around toward the back where the SUVs had been parked. Where Mateo had assumed she would stay hidden. Where he expected softness. Leverage. A final piece to force Vincent's hand. Claire's pulse went cold. Carbone moved with a limp she had not noticed before Kane gone now gun in hand, one shoulder dark with blood from the freight yard. Age had not made him slower where cruelty was concerned. It had only made him more efficient with it. He saw her through the windshield and smiled. That smile would live in her for years. Matteo turned too late. Carbone fired. The windshield cracked in a white, violent starburst. Matteo shoved Claire sideways as the second shot punched through the glass and buried itself in the headrest. "Move," he barked. Claire snatched the medical bag and threw herself out the rear door into cold air and gravel. Matteo returned fire over the roof. Carbone took cover behind a concrete barrier and shouted for two men near the side ramp. Now the danger had a direction. Claire ran. Not far. Only enough to reach the thick support pillar at the edge of the lot where the old loading dock met the river retaining wall. She crouched there, breath tearing in her throat, and looked wildly for Vincent. He was across the lot, engaging two men near the ramp, too far to see her, too close to the center of the fight to break away without being cut down. Carbone rose from behind the barrier. He saw her again. Claire's mind did a swift, brutal calculation. No clean escape route. No cover strong enough if he closed the angle. No weapon in her hand except the metal clasp of the medical bag and the broken bottleneck glittering near a drain where someone had dropped it in the chaos. She grabbed the bottle. Carbone came forward, gun steady. "So, that's her?" he said, almost conversationally. "The girl from the restaurant." Claire's back hit concrete. The wind off the river cut through her coat. Her fingers tightened around the jagged glass until it bit her palm. "You won't touch him through me," she said. Though what she meant was Mia. Carbone laughed softly. "Child, I already did." He lifted the gun. Claire threw the bottle with every ounce of strength panic and fury could give her. It spun end over end and struck his wrist just as he fired. The shot went wild into the steel above her head. Across the lot, Vincent turned. The next seconds happened too fast for clean memory. He crossed the distance like something unleashed, slamming into Carbone hard enough to drive them both sideways into the gravel. The gun skidded away under a truck. Carbone struck with the edge of his hand. Vincent answered with a fist to the ribs, another to the jaw. Men shouted. Someone fired toward the warehouse windows. Smoke thickened. The river wind carried cinders from somewhere burning near the loading dock. But inside that circle of violence it became only the two of them. Years of blood betrayal dead names, and ruined nights crashed into flesh at close range. Carbone fought like a man who had built himself on other people's fear and could not survive being ordinary. Vincent fought like a man who had finally found something outside himself worth living long enough to protect. Carbone got hold of a knife from somewhere inside his coat. Claire screamed before she knew she had breath for it. Vincent caught the wrist twisted, drove it into the gravel until the blade fell. Carbone headbutted him hard enough to stagger him, rolled, reached for the dropped gun with blood slicking his fingers. Claire was moving before thought. She snatched the gun from beneath the truck tire and kicked it farther across the lot. Carbone turned toward her just long enough for Vincent to hit him again. This time the old man went down flat. Vincent followed one knee driving into Carbone's chest, one hand at his throat, the other finding a second weapon at his own back, and bringing it up with brutal calm until the muzzle pressed straight into Carbone's coat. Everything around them seemed to stop. Not the battle entirely. Shots still cracked from inside the warehouse. Men still moved in the smoke. But the center of the lot narrowed until only this mattered. Carbone looked up at the gun and then at Claire, standing 6 feet away with blood on her palm and terror still bright in her face. He smiled through split lips. "Do it," he rasped. "Show her." Vincent's finger tightened. Claire saw it. Saw the exact point where all his grief, rage, love, and hunger to end the threat drew into one terrible line aimed downward. If he pulled the trigger, Carbone died, and something else in Vincent hardened forever beside him. She stepped forward before fear could stop her. Vincent. He did not look at her. The gun did not move. Wind pressed smoke through the lot in ragged ribbons. Somewhere behind them, Leo shouted for the rear entrance to be cleared. Somewhere farther off, a siren wailed, still distant. Claire forced air into her lungs. Vincent. This time his eyes flicked toward her without lifting his head. She saw everything in them. Rage raw enough to blister. Exhaustion. The old belief that death was the simplest language men like these deserved. And beneath it, buried and fighting to breathe the part of him that still wanted another life more than he trusted it. "If you kill him like this," she said, voice shaking but clear, "he keeps you." Carbone laughed again, weaker now. Listen to her. She thinks redemption is contagious. Claire never took her eyes off Vincent. Don't let the worst man in your life write your ending. The lot went strange and still. Vincent's chest rose once, fell. She thought of Mia, upstairs in the cabin, asking if Claire could braid hair better than cartoons. Thought of Elena's message. Thought of the restaurant and the plate of pasta set down before a girl with $5 and no dignity left to spend. Thought of the man who could not look away from humiliation, because some part of him had known it too well. "You come home?" she said softly. "Not with this on your hands." The old rage in his face did not disappear. It changed shape. That was all. Slowly, with visible effort, Vincent lowered the gun. Carbone stared at him, and for the first time all day the older man's face showed something that did not look like cruelty. It looked like disbelief. Vincent leaned down close enough that only the three of them could hear him. "You don't die by my hand," he said. "You live long enough to watch everything you built turn to ash." Then he stood. Leo and two others were there at once, hauling Carbone up, despite the old man's curses and half-broken resistance. Matteo retrieved the fallen gun. Someone dragged out ledger boxes and hard drives from the truck in the warehouse office. Names, accounts, routes. Enough paper and data to ruin whatever remained of Carbone's operations, even if the man himself tried to keep breathing out of spite. By the time the police sirens reached the edge of the district, Vincent's people were already moving the right evidence into the right hands, through channels Claire did not ask about and did not want to know in detail. Carbone was gone into custody no one public would ever confirm. His men were either down, fled, or suddenly willing to negotiate their futures elsewhere. The war did not end with one clean cinematic sound. It ended in smoke paperwork blood loss, and a man choosing not to become the thing his enemy expected. Claire found Vincent near the river wall after the lot had begun to empty. He stood alone with both hands braced on the concrete barrier, staring at the black water moving below. Without the gun in his hand and the men around him, he looked suddenly shockingly human. Coat torn, bruise rising under one eye, blood drying at the collar. The tremor in his right hand faint now, but still there. Not fear, aftermath. Claire walked to him slowly. He heard her and did not turn right away. When he did, the hardness was mostly gone from his face. In its place was a kind of naked weariness she had only seen once before in the hospital corridor, after a family member agreed to stop heroic measures and let someone die in peace. "You should have stayed in the vehicle," he said. Claire let out a short, unsteady breath that was almost a laugh. "You really want to open with that." A shadow of the old dry humor touched his mouth and vanished. Then the look in his eyes changed, dropped lower, warmer. More dangerous for not being violent at all. "You came anyway. So did you." He took one step toward her, then another. When he stopped, they were close enough that Claire could see the flecks of river mist caught in his hair. "I almost killed him," he said. The honesty of it landed with full force. She nodded once. "I know. I wanted to. I know." His gaze searched her face as if looking for disgust, and not finding it unsettled him more than anger would have. Claire lifted one hand carefully and touched the bruise under his eye with the backs of her fingers. He closed his eyes for 1 second under the contact. "You didn't," she said. When he opened them again, something inside him had shifted. Not repaired, not absolved, but loosened, as if a knot pulled tight for years had finally been given a fraction of mercy. "You were never my weakness," he said quietly. "You were the first reason I ever had to stop." The words hit her so hard she forgot the river, the smoke, the blood on her own cuff. She stepped into him before thinking better of it, and his arms came around her with a force that said he had been holding himself back for hours and had no interest in doing it 1 second longer. Claire buried her face against his chest and felt his heartbeat, fast and human and gloriously still there. When he kissed her, it was nothing like the kiss on the porch. That had been hunger-fighting restraint. This was relief stripped bare. Gratitude. Grief. A promise neither of them would have trusted enough to say out loud if not for the fact that they were both still standing here to mean it. Weeks later, the cabin sounded different. No gunfire in the woods, no midnight convoys, no men rotating perimeter watch every 2 hours. The house had not become magic. It still held the memory of what it had sheltered. But the air inside it no longer felt borrowed from catastrophe. Carbone's network collapsed faster than Claire would have thought possible once its spine had been broken. Men who had sworn loyalty rerouted themselves toward survival. Accounts froze. Warehouses changed hands. 2 legitimate freight companies announced restructuring that nobody on the evening news understood, and nobody in Vincent's world misunderstood at all. He spent long days in Chicago and longer nights returning to Galena with less blood on him each time. Not none. Less. That mattered. Claire went back to school. Not immediately, not gracefully, but truly. She sat for the exam she thought she would miss, and did better than she should have on 2 hours of sleep and a heart still relearning ordinary panic from extraordinary. She resumed clinicals, rode the train again, carried flashcards in her coat pocket, took notes while eating vending machine crackers in fluorescent hospital lounges. Only now, when she came back to the cabin on the days she stayed there, a small pair of sneakers waited by the door, and a child's voice called her name from somewhere upstairs as if it belonged in the house. Mia attached herself to Claire with the full, practical confidence of a child who had made an emotional decision, and saw no reason adults should complicate it. She wanted braids before schoolwork, stories before bed, help finding the purple marker, opinions on whether rabbits preferred toast or strawberries if given a fair choice. Claire answered all of it. Vincent watched more than he interrupted. Once late on a Sunday afternoon, Claire stood at the kitchen counter chopping vegetables, while Mia colored beside her, and Vincent repaired a broken cabinet hinge with far more concentration than the task deserved. The radio played softly in the background. Rain tapped at the windows. The whole scene was so ordinary, Claire felt tears threaten for no reason except that ordinariness after enough fear begins to look like a miracle. Mia held up a new drawing. The yellow door again. The house, the 3 figures. This time there was a 4th shape near the porch. A dog with crooked legs and impossible ears. "What's that?" Claire asked. Mia looked offended. "Our dog." Vincent glanced up from the hinge. "We don't have a dog." Mia nodded patiently, as if adults often missed obvious facts. "Not yet." Claire laughed. Vincent looked at both of them as though this somehow was the scene that frightened him most. Not because it was dangerous, because it was possible. One evening in early spring he came home with his knuckles raw and his jaw set in that old hard line Claire had learned to distrust. She met him in the mudroom before he could make it to the sink. What happened? Nothing that matters. No. He looked away first. That told her enough. Not all old loyalties died cleanly. Not all threats ended the first time someone laid them in the ground. There were still loose men and old debts and habits of violence that did not vanish just because one central war had ended. But this time he did not shut her out. He told her the truth in pieces while she cleaned his knuckles under warm water and antiseptic and kitchen light. Not enough to drag her into darkness for the sake of confession. Enough that she never again had to stand in a doorway and guess whether the blood on him belonged to a stranger or a ghost. They learned that version of honesty slowly, like healing, like trust. By summer, the cabin had become less of a hideout and more of a home. Mia left sandals by the porch and crayons on every flat surface. Claire studied at the dining table, while Vincent handled the legitimate side of his shipping business on calls he no longer took in whispers. Elena complained that no one appreciated proper bread. Leo stopped knocking before entering the back mudroom and started bringing groceries unasked. Matteo learned to text before dropping security updates into dinner. Life did not become simple. It became shared. That was better. The restaurant in River North looked exactly the same the night they went back. Same warm candlelight. Same polished wood. Same windows reflecting the city in soft gold. Same hush of expensive silverware and conversations practiced low for intimacy. Claire stopped just inside the entrance and felt the whole first night rise around her with unnerving clarity. The dress, the $5, the text on the screen. The humiliation she had thought would swallow her whole. Only now she wore a soft navy dress of her own choosing. Her purse held more than bus fare. Vincent's hand was warm at the small of her back, and Mia, in a cream cardigan and patent shoes she kept admiring whenever the light caught them, stood between them holding both their hands as if this were the most natural arrangement in the world. The hostess smiled. Reservation. Claire opened her mouth then paused when Vincent looked at her. Something wicked and tender flickered in his eyes. Bennett, she said. For now. The hostess led them to a table not far from the window where she had once sat alone. Mia climbed into her chair and immediately asked whether pasta was better at restaurants with candles because the candles made the noodles feel important. Claire laughed. Vincent leaned back and watched them both with a softness that still startled her every time it appeared. When the menus came, he did not even glance at his. Tonight, he set eyes on Claire. You order whatever you want. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. You remember everything. He held her gaze across the table, and the city beyond the glass seemed to fall away, until there was only this. I remember you. Mia, oblivious to the weight of that sentence, and perhaps wiser for it pulled a folded sheet of paper from her cardigan pocket and spread it across the white tablecloth. Another drawing. The yellow door. The house. The 3 figures. The dog this time with better ears. And beside the house under a giant impossible sun, 4 shaky printed words. U.S. Home Forever. Yes. Claire looked at Vincent, he looked at Mia, then at Claire again. Something quiet and immense passed between them. She reached across the table and threaded her fingers through his. For the first time since the night a stranger bought dinner for a girl with $5 and too much pride to ask for help, Claire felt the full shape of what had been built from that moment. Not rescue, not possession. Not even fate, though lesser people might have called it that. A choice. Then another made under pressure in fear, in hunger, in blood, in the trembling aftermath when easier lives would have turned back. Claire looked at the drawing. Then at the man who had once told her she deserved to eat even when the world tried to teach her otherwise. And very softly she said, I think we made it home. Vincent's hand tightened around hers. This time when he answered, there was no shadow left in his voice. We did.